What y'all listening to?
Limelight Highlight Podcast.
Welcome back to the show, your silver lining space to take a break from the stressful every day. I'm your host, as always, Jonathan Rosario, aka J Rose. And the last time it was March, we did a couple of episodes on women's empowerment and the women who helped shape society into what it is today. We still got a long ways to go, but I'd like to revisit that same concept this month and try to do a little better job in terms of talking points with the way our format has changed. But yeah, as always, before we get into the show, we got some announcements to make. Spring is right around the corner. So on top of the normal last Tuesday of every month where the Block Gives Back goes and feeds those in need, their busiest time of the year is coming up in April, where they select 4 blocks in 4 weeks where they can get those involved in community and clean up those selected blocks. And if you'd like to get involved and help out with either of these events, I'm sure there's a spot or a way you can help. Just make sure you visit their website, theblockgivesback.org, and figure out how you can get involved. And if you can't be there physically, donate a little something their way to help out with the funds on getting these events working out. Maybe a payment of $4.44 to 4 blocks in 4 weeks. You know, some 444 stuff going on. Some of you spend more than that on a cup of coffee, and it'll go to a good cause. So help out any way you can. And yeah, now on to the show. Now, as I was saying before, this month is Women's History Month. And I like to go over some of the lesser known yet very important women that help shape society. If you Google the first female pilot, the first person that comes up, which is kind of weird, is Amelia Earhart. Same goes with the first thought that comes to mind when mentioning the first female pilot. But the truth is, Raymonde de la Roche was the first licensed female pilot. She was born August 22nd, 1882. Now, with my background being in aviation, I figured, why not highlight someone to be an extremely important part of the world of aviation and share it with you guys. She was the world's first licensed female pilot on, get this, March 8th, 1910. If you don't know why March 8th is such a coincidence or a crazy date for her to get her license, for those who don't know, International Women's Day is March 8th. Just thought that was pretty interesting. And being an international holiday, it's celebrated all over the world. There are different dates as to when certain countries have officially adopted or established when it was started, but it can go as far back as 1857. Regardless of when it was officially celebrated, the fact is this woman was the first pilot to earn a license to fly and was recognized as a pilot. During the early 1800s, women were generally expected to be home and only perform domestic duties, such as taking care of children and submitting to their husbands or male dominant figures of the house. Socially, women were considered weaker and unequal to men. A lot has changed, huh? Or depending on where you're at, it hasn't. They had no control over their lives, and everything was entirely controlled by men in the society. Still, once again, big and not so big differences. At that time, their key purpose was to look out for a husband or to look for a husband and give birth and take care of their husbands throughout their entire lives, as well as the children, until they got old enough to do their own thing. So much so that it was considered taboo for women to remain single. The only time women owned property was when she was still in her father's home. But the minute she gets married, that property ownership belongs to the husband, which is why I think women like Raymonde are such outliers and iconic figures in history, because for people to go against the grain during their respective times and succeed, it speaks volumes for itself. So even with all the oppression in the 1800s in general, the women's movements became so effective that women began to challenge those social traditional norms, as well as those economical and even the political intellectuals that had kept them oppressed for so long. This was the starting point for their movement to redefine their roles in society, and Elise Raymonde de Roche was born in Paris, France, and that was her given name. She was the daughter of a plumber, and while growing up, she would be considered a tomboy. I don't know if that term is still politically correct, but I mean, you get the point. She enjoyed sports. She had an interest in motorcycles and cars. When she got older, she became an actress and used the stage name Raymonde de la Roche. She had been acquainted with several different aviators at the time, so she pretty much had an into the world of aviation. In October of 1909, she begged her friend Charles Voisin of the Voisin brothers to teach her how to fly. Charles happened to be an aviator and an airplane builder. And so on October 22nd, 1909, she went to the Voisin brothers' base of operations and tried to learn how to fly. Unfortunately, his aircraft could only seat one person, but that didn't stop her from learning because she would operate the plane by herself while Charles gave her instructions from the ground. After she mastered taxiing around the airfield, for those who don't know what taxiing is, it's basically being in the aircraft, driving around in the aircraft but without flying. So after she mastered taxiing around the airfield, she lifted off and flew just about 300 yards. This flight is often cited as the first by a woman in a powered heavier than aircraft. And decades later, an aviation journalist kind of downplayed her story. He kind of romanticized it, I guess you can say, writing that she had only been in one flight before as a passenger, and when she first took the controls, he wrote that Charles expressly forbade her to attempt a flight, and after taxiing twice across the airfield, she took off flying and handling the controls with quick, cool precision. So even though that story wasn't really accurate, he kind of painted De La Roche as a headstrong woman making the flight after a few lessons, even defying the orders of Charles. You know, it making her kind of a rebel figure, even though that wasn't the real story. But regardless, the magazine at the time was called Flight Magazine. It reported that she had been taking lessons, and the day after her first flight, she circled the flying field twice, the turns being made with ease. And once again, that was in October 1909. And by March 8th, 1910, she became the first woman in the world to receive a pilot's license when the Aero Club of France issued her license, number 36 of the International Aeronautic Federation. It's kind of similar to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration in the U.S., I guess, the French part. And after she participated in aviation meetings, after that, she participated in aviation meetings in Egypt, as well as St. Petersburg and Budapest and Rouen. And during the show in St. Petersburg, she was personally congratulated by the Tsar Nicholas II. Now, you got to understand that at this time, all of these places were very male dominant, especially in these areas during the world. And even for this time, let alone back in the day. So for the Tsar to actually congratulate a woman is a pretty big deal. In July 1910, she was participating in the week-long air show in France, where her plane crashed and she suffered such severe injuries that they thought she would die or surely wouldn't be able to fly again. But 2 years later, she was back in the skies, flying like if it never happened. On November 25th of 1913, De La Roche won the Aero Club of France's Femina Cup. The Femina Cup was an award of 200 francs, which is currency in France, and was established in 1910 by Pierre Lafayette. I really hope I'm saying these guys' names right, because, I mean, I don't know French, and the way they pronounce their names is kind of weird, but you get the point. He was the publisher of the French women's magazine Femina, and that cup was to honor women pilots. The challenge was open to all women aviators, only women aviators, and she won for a nonstop long distance flight of over 4 hours. In June 1919, she set 2 women's altitude records and also the women's distance record at 201 miles. So that's pretty long for that time. And De La Roche was a talented engineer and went on to the airfield at Le Crotoy as part of her plan to become the first female test pilot. I mean, she was the first female pilot, so why not be the first female test pilot, right? She co-piloted an experimental aircraft, and on its landing approach, the plane went into a dive and crashed, unfortunately killing both De La Roche and the co-pilot. And in Paris, in the Paris Le Bourget airport in France, there's actually a statue of De La Roche. There's Women of Aviation Worldwide Week is held annually during the week, including March 8th, which marks the anniversary of Raymonde de la Roche getting her pilot's license. And for me, ever since I was little, I was always amazed by aviation. Jets, planes, helicopters, spaceships, you name it. If it flew, if it went into the air and flew, I had an interest. And I never got my pilot's license, but it's a huge reason as to why I truly enjoy working on aircraft and got into the aviation industry. I might get my pilot's license one day, but regardless, the story fascinated me. Time and time again, you got world records that are labeled impossible or they can't be done. And the minute one person breaks it, the record is open to everybody else. A bunch of other people constantly tend to follow, and the bar raises as to what's possible or what's impossible. And the same goes for this woman. In 1910, she was the first woman to get a pilot's license, and 3 years later, she's winning a women's cup for women aviators. She set records first of her kind. She paved the way to show that other women, if they want to do something, they truly can. History honors her with statues and commemorates events in her name, and she's one of the many women in history that deserves to be highlighted and recognized. And I don't know if it's because she was French and not American that her name isn't as well known, but it definitely should be. A lot of this information is stuff I didn't know beforehand that I found to be really interesting and wanted to share with you. So I hope I gave you some pretty cool information. I hope you remember her name, and if you have a little one who's into aviation, as I was, you teach them this history. There are plenty of women pilots now, but Raymonde de la Roche was the first. And that's all I really have for you today. I really surprised myself with some of the information I learned while doing this podcast, and I just really enjoy learning about figures in history that you don't hear about as often, and I hope you spread this useful information. And if this inspired you or jogged your memory of a powerful figure in history that isn't that well known, or if you'd like to share a feel-good or positive story to contribute to the podcast by sharing some good news and useful information, or even just to give us some feedback, be sure to send us a message and check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Limelight Highlight. You can find us at Twitter at LL Highlight, and if you'd like to send us an email, you can do that at limelighthehighlight@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating if you think it deserves it. And be sure to share, and if you haven't done so yet, be sure to follow the pages and subscribe to the podcast for any new episodes that get released. Until next time, be humble, be helpful, pay it forward, and be the best you. See y'all next time.